Hey everyone, let's talk a little bit about Margery Kempe and Julian of Norwich, both of which are medieval mystics. So what does it mean to be a mystic? Well, I provided a dictionary definition for you, which sort of explains that even though the means by which these mystics approached their lives and their works and their relationship to these works, they could range anywhere from ecstatic visions, which is what we see with both of our authors, to just simple prayerful contemplation. But it's all about the soul's mystical union with God, and that's what the visions are mostly about. And the Holy Scripture is what is being contemplated. All right. So we often find that mystics had some kind of traumatic event that led to their visions, maybe an illness or an injury. And the visions are often of God, Jesus, Mary, or angels, other times some other biblical stories, but these seem to be the most frequent images in their visions. They hear voices of the divine giving them comfort or telling them to do this, that, or the other. These mystics were often persecuted, particularly if they were female, and they often behaved poorly in public, I guess, is what made people uncomfortable about their visions. They didn't keep it to themselves. They shared what they were feeling. So I gave you an example of a couple of these mystics. Hildegard of Bingen is a famous one, Benedictine abbess, and here's a picture of her with kind of this represents sort of the fire of inspiration coming down to denote her images. Some folks now think maybe she had epileptic seizures or suffered from severe migraines. But at any rate, she produced a lot of written work and great music. So I gave you a link in the PDF to some of her music, just really beautiful stuff. Meister Eckhart was another one, a male mystic, German philosopher and mystic, and I gave you an idea of what he was interested in. All of his sermons were about man's soul and how pure it could be, etc. So those were two of the more famous ones. We're looking at Julian of Norwich, an English anchoress, and we'll talk about what an anchoress is in a moment. And we're reading selections for her, Divine Revelations of Divine Love, and I think our book calls it The Showings. It's another name of it. So this is one of the first theological books about religious matters in the English language, known to be written by a woman. So that's one of her claims to fame. Her visions began when she was around 30, again as a result of a serious illness, and she had physical manifestations and visions of Christ, and she recorded those and became quite famous because of her visions. An anchoress is someone who, or an anchorite, is male. They're kind of like hermits. You know the word hermit. They live by themselves, very ascetic. They don't live in a lot of luxury. They give everything up. What's different about an anchoress, and that's this part of the word, anchor, they do not wander. Hermits can move around. They are anchored to their particular location, usually a church, right? So they would have a small cell attached to the church. Often they had a window so they could watch the Eucharist, the service, but they often got a reputation for being wise and dispensing, great advice. People would come to them. I have an article linked here to Wikipedia. That's just kind of a good general overview of what an anchorite would have been. It's kind of interesting if you want to know more about that. Margery Kempe, on the other hand, was not an anchorite. She was out in the world. Her book was considered one of the first autobiographies in the English language. So both she and Julian have that in common, being the first. And I have here, she went on a lot of pilgrimages, a lot of journeys, but she went from England, and you can follow her pilgrimage here all the way down to Jerusalem. And this was in 1413. It's quite a remarkable journey to have been undertaken by anyone, much less a woman. So Another thing we want to talk about is the classes of medieval society, and I'm sure you've covered this elsewhere, kind of divided into what they called estates, kind of what we call social classes. So there was the church, then the nobility, the knights were in that group, and aristocrats, and the third estate, which were the peasants. They were the ones who produced all the food for these two groups, right? Um, the males were kind of defined by what they did for a living, right? Were they in the church? Were they knights? Were they peasants? And this again comes from Deborah B. Schwartz's lecture notes. I kind of borrowed them for her, give her credit there. Women were classified a little differently. They were born into the second or third estate, and sometimes they could become members of the first if they joined the church, became an abbess or something like that. But they were more categorized in their own estates, which had to do with sexuality, whether they were virgins, wives, or widows. So before they were with anybody, when they were with somebody, after they were with somebody. Okay, so it's sort of interesting that they had this different way of being classified, not by their contributions, but by their sexual status. Talk a little bit about the literacy rates in medieval England. It's difficult to determine what anybody's literacy rates were in Europe at that time, because literacy often referred to being able to read in Latin, not English. So even if you had some familiarity with English, you may not know Latin and you would not have been considered literate. So for the most part, estimates of literacy rates for males, and this was up around 1500, towards the end of the Middle Ages, was between 10 and 25%, and for women this would have been even lower. Most of the upper clergy, sometimes not even the lower clergy, were illiterate. Some nobility, aristocrats, probably not the knights in all cases, and mostly the peasants were not literate. Julian was educated enough to write the Revelations of Divine Love. Margery, however, was illiterate, and you can imagine what sort of problems this would create with having someone else copy down your words for you, what they might have changed, what they might have left out. You would have no way of knowing. And in this misogynistic age of the Middle Ages, where women weren't terribly valued, having a male transcribe your text is fraught with all sorts of problems, as you can imagine. We're not going to go into those, but you can imagine what those might be. And we have to assume, because we have nothing else to go on, that her texts do provide an accurate look at her life, but of course we'll never know for sure. The last thing we're going to talk about here is affective piety. So affective piety is closely related to Margery Kempe. It's having a extremely emotional, physically emotional connection with an experience. In our case here, art or literature, the Bible. So these people like Margery will act out what we'd call drama queens today, right? Deeply despairing, deeply sorrowful, deeply guilty. Their sinful nature just overwhelms them, crying and weeping and wailing. So this kind of came into practice between turn of the millennium up through the 1300s, and then kind of faded away in popularity. And I gave you this example of the Isenheim altar piece as an example of this overly emotional experience of Christ's crucifixion, for example, which was meant to inspire this kind of emotionalism in the viewers. And again, I gave you a link to a Khan Academy article, which is really interesting if you have time and interest.